Abigail Shrier is an anti-trans activist who wrote the book Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. She's received a lot of fucking backlash since publishing this book, and I felt unqualified to talk about her because I haven't read her book. One of the biggest criticisms against Shrier's views is that she supports the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a term used to describe the idea that there is a form of gender dysphoria that results as a social contagion, meaning that through the idea of gender dysphoria being spread, some may develop symptoms that mimic what are being described about gender dysphoria. From my knowledge, the research on this is limited and it's not a well-accepted idea in the medical field. However, while this doesn't fully discount the idea, it does give it a little less credibility. The idea is also rooted in really bad science. The word was created after an adjunct assistant professor named Lisa Lippman surveyed parents from 3 different anti-trans websites. Some may call the people of these websites gender critical as opposed to anti-trans. However, I made a whole video discussing trans people and the differences between gender and sex. It's not gender these people are criticizing, because most of these people will participate in gendered activities and gender it as such, whether it's women wearing traditionally women's clothing, perfume, doing makeup, etc., or men getting their hands dirty, roughhousing, drinking beer, even though it's the worst, most fucking bland alcoholic drink you could possibly have. Actual critiques of gender almost always result in the realization that sex does not define gender, and it could even be considered ideological to force the idea onto people that your sex does have to define your gender. An ironic juxtaposition to the claim by some of these people that trans activists are pushing a gender ideology, which is a claim I once used to believe. I do have to admit that I clearly have some type of bias towards the rights of trans people, which I guess can be controversial. However, I'll try my best to see both sides here. I have no problem holding views some people consider transphobic, and a lot of my views used to be transphobic before I spent the time to actually educate myself. Before we start, there are some views I do hold that could be considered transphobic by some people. I could be wrong about any of these views, they're subject to change, but here are my currently possibly transphobic views just to show that I'm not against having an open mind to this book. I don't think kids should medically transition, and to say that puberty blockers are reversible is untrue. I do, however, think the choice should be between the parent, doctor and child, and it's none of the government's business. Social transition is also fine. I think trans women have an advantage in women's sports. Based off my current understanding of sex and gender, trans women are women, however their sex is still male, and trans men are men, however their sex is still female. This is important to recognise for the individual, as it doesn't discount who they are, it's just an acknowledgement of their physical situation, which isn't really anyone's business at all, outside of potential love interests and for medical reasons. And finally, it's not transphobic to not want to date a trans person. I'm sure there are a couple more, but the point is I'm not against being politically incorrect. I also recognise none of these views are reasons to hate anyone who is trans. These views and no views can be used for valid justification of transphobic remarks. Just because some trans people may consider these views transphobic does not mean all do, nor does it imply they are stupid snowflakes. I'm sure there are many good arguments against my beliefs that they could hold. I think it's important to remember throughout this video, regardless of what is said, trans people are just people like anyone else. Each person that fits under that label is like anyone else, a unique individual with their own individual life experiences, values, beliefs, families, friends, history, etc. The label is nothing more than an attempt at using language to easily convey that a person does not slot into the gender norms typically associated with their birth sex, and while a lot of people under this label will have a handful of shared experiences that may lead to some of them holding similar perspectives and values, for every experience each individual who falls under this label does share, there's hundreds or maybe thousands of experiences they don't share that will also have impacted their values and perspectives. It should not, at any point, under any circumstances, ever be forgotten that the individuals that fall under this label or any label are just people as unique as any other person. The moment we forget that, we dehumanize, and when we dehumanize, we discriminate, and when we discriminate, we spread hate, and when we spread hate, we start wars, and when we start wars, we hurt and kill each other under a false sense of righteousness. Do not forget for a moment that every single individual you see, from black to white, from gay to straight, from trans to cis, from atheist to religious, from sane to insane, from square to addict, from rich to homeless, are all unique individuals that are deserving of some degree of respect. But with that being said, let's get on to reading the blurb. Until just a few years ago, gender dysphoria, severe discomfort in one's biological sex, was vanishingly rare. It was typically found in less than 0.01% of the population, emerged in early childhood, and afflicted males almost exclusively. It's important to recognise here she says almost exclusively. There are cases of trans men throughout history which shows this is not a new phenomenon. However, through what I've seen of her other content, I feel like the wording she uses tries to paint the idea that trans men are sort of a new thing, which they're not. She may not be meaning to do this, but that's how it feels to me, and I think it's important to be wary of her phrasing if you're deciding whether to believe her views. But today, whole groups of female friends in colleges, high schools, and even middle schools across the country are coming out as transgender. These girls, who had never experienced any discomfort in their biological sex until they heard a coming out story from a speaker at a school assembly, or discovered the internet community of trans influencers. I'm pretty sure what she's referring to here is the study I referenced earlier that was rooted in bad science that caused the assistant professor to coin the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. The information about those trans people was given by parents who disagreed with their kids' transness. It's very common for parents to exclaim to their trans sons and daughters, "But you've never shown any signs of this before," even though it's something they've been struggling with often either since puberty or their whole life, but learn to repress any preference for activities or ways of presenting associated with the gender they were not assigned at birth. It's a very huge possibility that these trans men have felt that way their whole life and the parents just never got any signs on the external. As for the idea they're coming out in groups, I used to believe this was a sign of it being a possible social contagion. However, after some thought, I realised obviously people with similar life experiences and interests and perspectives are going to be drawn to each other, and trans people are going to share some experiences that most people won't share with them that give them a certain perspective and insight. It's also not uncommon for trans people to come out to some of their friends and start engaging with other members of the community who are closeted. When one of these people in these friend groups come out, it may give the others of the group who are all closeted the courage to do the same. I'm not entirely willing to discount the idea it can, at times, be a social contagion. However, the evidence to support this idea is limited and very untrustworthy. Fuck man, I said monotone as fuck, bro. We need to get the vibes going up in here, bro. Unsuspecting parents are awakening to find their daughters enthralled to hip trans YouTube stars and gender-affirming educators and therapists who push life-changing interventions on young girls, including medically unnecessary double mastectomies and puberty blockers that can cause permanent infertility. This is just fear-mongering, right? There are trans people on YouTube, I've watched some of them, but I only know one who tried to push that onto people and they were heavily reprimanded by other creators, including other trans creators. Not to mention, trans YouTubers are not hip in any capacity, but how would try and know this, because anyone who uses the word hip to refer to something they mean as trendy is clearly so fucking out of tune with modern trends. I also say this is fear-mongering due to the way she wrote it. It's clearly trying to give a sense of concern and urgency, like something terrible is happening right under our noses that we can't see or stop, and even worse, it's happening to the kids. They're transing the kids. What will we do? Also, double mastectomies have always been very easy for younger women to get with permission from their parents if having boobs makes them uncomfortable, and people don't really bat an eye for the most part. But the moment a trans man wants to do it, it's the end of the world because he's just a poor, confused, dumb girl that's been brainwashed. Some would argue it's different because of the reasons for discomfort potentially being a short-lasting social contagion, but the same could be argued for young cis women being influenced by their small-chested friends or the desire to remove the sexualization of themselves by the men around them. As again, I don't think trans kids should medically transition till at least 16, and I honestly don't think anyone, both cis and trans people, should get any kind of cosmetic surgery until at least 18. But when it comes to trans people, the cosmetic surgery is not cosmetic for the sake of being cosmetic, but it has medical reasons behind it, which is why it can justify 16 plus as opposed to 18. As again though, I don't think it has anything to do with the government, and the decision should be entirely down to the doctor, the patient, and the legal guardian. Abigail Shrier, a writer for the Wall Street Journal, has dug deep into the trans epidemic, talking to the girls, their agonized parents, and the counselors and doctors who enable gender transitions, as well as to detransitioners, young women who bitterly regret what they have done to themselves. Coming out as transgender immediately boosts these girls' social status, Shrier finds, but once they take the first step of transition, it's not an easy walk back. She offers urgently needed advice about how parents can protect their daughters. A generation of girls is at risk. Abigail Shrier's essential book will help you understand what the trans craze is and how you can inoculate your child against it, or how to retrieve her from this dangerous path. Can we just that struck me right in my soul. Wow, fucking beautiful. Despite that beautiful writing, Being trans does not boost the average person's social status. If anything, they're often outcasted, sometimes even by their own family, which we'll get into in a bit. If you call that an increase in social status, you're fucking delusional. I know a good amount of trans people, and not a single one I know increased their social status from it. Yeah, I know a few of them who got disowned, kicked out, mocked, or in some way lost family, friends, or their safety. The way she ends off the blurb saying that you should retrieve your child back from this dangerous path discounts actual trans people and just encourages parents to discriminate against their own kid. I think it's important that as a parent you ask questions and really dig deep and ensure this is the right path for them and that they're making the right decision. However, this is not what she advocates for. Shrier does not advocate for listening and understanding your kid. She does not advocate for helping your kid find out if they really are trans. What she advocates for here is to flat out deny the existence of the situation your child is informing you they believe they are in. It advocates for ignorance. For the rest of the book, I'm not going to read each chapter in the video. I'll just be taking key points from the chapter and quoting parts of the book to criticize the points that she makes. There's this author's note that claims she will respect the pronouns of trans adults here. Let me point out that all trans adults were once trans kids, but we'll also find out if this is true as we read, because this review on the website I'm reading the book on, because fuck off if you think I'm giving this bitch money, said that she didn't do that. And then there's another review here which is like toxic but like oddly wholesome. Loved reading about a deranged femoid with a victim complex go on a schizo rant about trans people for almost 300 pages. Would read again. In the introduction to the book, she talks about a trans guy named Lucy. I will refer to Lucy with he, him pronouns for the duration that he's brought up, although in the book Shrier uses she, her pronouns for him, despite the fact it states he was going to college, meaning he was an adult, unless this was in the UK, which is unlikely as they talk about him being in middle school and him being in 4th grade, and also the mother being a southern attorney. It talks about Lucy being a girly girl and liking girly things as a kid and liking Disney princesses and girly toys and all that fucking shit. And apparently she once cried because she got a pixie cut and said it looked like a boy, according to the mother. It also talks about how she never really fit in with girls and always fit in better with boys, which you can twist to either being a sign he was trans or a sign he's not and was influenced by being surrounded by boys. But I know many women who have been friends with men their whole life and none of them turned out to be trans men, so I find that position to be pretty rooted in bias. Also, when it comes to the pixie cut, if you're not generally socially accepted as a kid and that's an insecurity, then on top of not being socially accepted, you're now a girl that looks like a boy, you're going to feel embarrassed because you're scared for your social status. Not to mention, just because someone is a trans man doesn't mean they can't like feminine things. Men can like feminine things. I guarantee Shrier wouldn't argue that a trans woman who liked Disney princesses and women gendered toys as a kid is any more of a woman than Lucy is a man. So why do these things have any effect on the perception of Lucy's gender to Shrier? Gender and gender expression are separate things, although they often do go hand in hand. To add on to that, if you have a feeling that you want to be a guy when you're born a girl, for example, and then you feel embarrassed by that, you'd probably deflect to hide it, especially if you live in the South of America where they aren't exactly the most accepting of people who don't conform to traditional norms, and you've had those values instilled in you. It's also very common for gender dysphoria not to become even noticeable until puberty, when physical changes start to actually occur. In the intro, when talking about Lucy, she says this: with an invitation to state her name, sexual orientation, and gender pronouns, Lucy registered the new chance at social acceptance, a first wave of belonging. When her anxiety flared later that autumn, she decided with several of her friends that their angst had a fashionable cause: gender dysphoria. Was the fucking gender dysphoria like Gucci or some shit? Within a year, Lucy had begun a course of testosterone, but her real drug, the one that hooked her, was the promise of a new identity, a shaved head, boys' clothes, and a new name formed the baptismal waters of a female-to-male rebirth. The next step, if she took it, would be top surgery, a euphemism for a voluntary double mastectomy. How do you know this wasn't gender dysphoria? I asked her mother, because she'd never shown anything like that. I never heard her ever express any discomfort over her body. She got her period when she was in 4th grade, and that was super embarrassing for her because it was so early, but I never heard her complain about her body. I just want you to note the way she words this. She words it to try and convey as if this all started suddenly from being asked for her pronouns on a college application form, and also that she did it to be fashionable. However, do you really think she sat down with her friends and they were like, "Oh my god, Lucy, you should be trans, that'd be so fashionable"? I don't know how she got this information, since according to her mother, Lucy never explained this story of coming to find himself and instead just flew in rages like, some kind of monster. Under the influence of testosterone and the spell of transgression, the mother said Lucy became churlish and aggressive, refusing to explain this new identity or answer any questions about it. She accused her mother of being a gatekeeper and a transphobe. Whether that was on purpose, who knows, but all these ways of wording things I'm spotting can't be a coincidence. Yes, in a lot of cultures, testosterone will make humans more aggressive. The reason I say with a lot of cultures is because how testosterone makes you act is very culturally dependent. But I doubt she was acting aggressive without prompt. You don't get lashed out on for some respectful questions. What you might get lashed out on for is repeated questions, especially if they're asked condescendingly or with disapproval. Not to generalise as well, but the South isn't exactly known for their acceptance and progressive ideals, so it wouldn't be unlikely that the mother was maybe pushing it a bit and got lashed out on. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think she'd be lashed out on like this if it was unprompted, and if it was unprompted, that's terrible, but it has nothing to do with them being trans. I know a lot of trans people who've never lashed out on their parents and called them transphobes, and I don't know a single person who did that without prompt. So if Lucy did that, it would be a pretty unique case. Shrier also says this. She said Lucy had discovered this identity with the help of the internet, which provides an endless array of transgender mentors who coach adolescents in the art of slipping into a new gender identity. Yes, my favourite art class. What to wear, how to walk, what to say, which internet companies sell the best breast binders, a breast compression garment worn under clothes, which organisations send them for free and guarantee discreet packaging so that parents never find out, how to persuade doctors to supply the hormones you want, how to deceive parents, or, if they resist your new identity, how to break away entirely. I'd like to point out that earlier Shrier claimed that Lucy decided he was trans after being first pushed in that direction by being asked for his pronouns on a college application. I still can't get over how dumb that claim is, by the way. And then decided upon it after talking with her friends during a very anxious autumn. Now Shrier claims he came to the conclusion after consuming trans content online, so which was it? There is ways to secretly get HRT, but as for trans men, how the fuck are they gonna hide their voice dripping all of a sudden, and the increase in hair growth? And as for trans women, how are they gonna hide their tits? Oh, they could get one of those fucking breast compression binders she was talking about, like she can get them free. They can get HRT discreetly, but it's not like they can take it for very long before someone finds out. Also, yes, binders can be unhealthy and you should ideally never wear them, but if you do, never wear them for more than 8 hours a day, which a lot of the videos talking about binders will go over, and not to mention sometimes cis women need binders for certain clothing, it's just not as common. She makes it out as if this is all kids online trying to defy their parents and escape reality through a false identity, which isn't true. People want their parents to accept them, they're terrified of not being accepted a lot of the time, but depending on how discriminatory your family is, sometimes the only route someone can take is to cut them off entirely. Also, as for the idea to false identity, check my video on the ego, but in short, the ego is the sense of self, and your sense of self will never be in full alignment with your actual self because the ego is a tool for expression and socializing, and ideally you should find a sense of self that you feel most comfortable existing within. The ways you find comfortable existing within are not your choice, however it is your choice whether to incorporate that into your sense of self and self-expression, and I think you owe it to yourself to fight for your right to exist in the way that feels most comfortable for you. In the book, she also talks about legally forcing people to use the right pronouns, which I also don't agree with. I think restricting people's speech is a dangerous game, and I will always argue for people's freedom to say what they want. But in a professional setting, like a hospital, when you're being treated as a patient, or at the workplace, which is the type of situations that she referred to, I think it's fair to expect people to attempt to use the right pronouns for a trans person, as purposefully not using them is disrespectful and a political statement, and ideally politics should be kept out of a professional environment and mutual respect should be prioritized. While I do support people's right not to respect people's pronouns, the analogy that she uses in this page is terrible. She compares it to an instance where the Supreme Court ruled that students do not have to salute the American flag, which is a really bad argument because people on the opposing side are just going to point out, well, a flag isn't going to be offended if I don't salute it. If I disrespect someone's pronouns, it can negatively impact them mentally, to which in my personal opinion I'd say it doesn't matter. Fuck that person for disrespecting you. I think they should be socially reprimanded. However, the government should not be involved because I believe that sets a bad precedent to restrict people's speech, and then from there we can have a conversation debating the precedent it sets and if it's something to worry about, but comparing it to not saluting the American flag is a terrible point to try and make. She also talks about a common thing a lot of trans people say, which is that they always knew they were different, and in this book the mother of Lucy claimed that Lucy stole it from the internet, but I feel like it'd probably make more sense if he just saw it on the internet and it resonated, so he used it to describe his own experience, because obviously trans people are going to have some shared experiences like I mentioned earlier. Shrier goes on to talk about how childhood gender dysphoria appears at ages 2 to 4 and can often get more severe in adolescence, claiming that childhood dysphoria resolves itself 70% of the time, but this does mean that 30% of the time it does not resolve itself and will require medical intervention at some point, in which case we need a protocol for it, because we can't leave 30% of those people entirely untreated. That would be fucked up. Also, let me point out that earlier when she talked about Lucy, she said Lucy came out as trans during her adolescence, conveniently around the time that gender dysphoria becomes less bearable. However, Shrier doesn't seem to acknowledge this. As she mentions later on in the book, she is an opinion writer, not an investigative reporter. Her job is to get clicks through writing opinions, not to investigate the truth. She talks about how in the past it affected only a small percentage of the population, however fails to recognise that as there is more awareness and accepting, people become more willing to come out and are more aware about who trans people are, and after hearing how trans people might be able to relate to the trans experience and realise they are trans through that. She also claims there was 0 pieces of scientific literature about trans men ages 11 to 21 before 2012, but literally a single Google search revealed to me a 2016 meta-analysis of studies released between 2002 and 2012, many of which reference trans men. We recognise that trans men exist at all, and through Shrier's own worldview, dysphoria first develops between ages 2 to 4 and worsens in adolescence, and 30% of the time doesn't get resolved on its own. Based off Shrier's own logic, then it's only logically consistent for her to assume trans men exist and have existed in the age group of 11 to 21, if they exist at all, which the literature shows they did and still do. She also goes on to ask this: why did the sex ratio flip from overwhelmingly boys to majority adolescent girls? Referencing the fact that now more trans men seem to exist than trans women, which is indeed a very peculiar phenomenon. However, to assume this means trans men are being brainwashed or manipulated is a very large jump to make. Some people do regret their transition, and that is terrible, and those people deserve compassion for the situation they found themselves in, because it's terrible. It's a terrible thing to go through. Looking at the statistics though, it's important to recognise regret rates are extremely rare. In a pretty large study that looked at over 22,000 cases of gender-affirming surgery across a range of surgeons in multiple countries, it was found that out of over 22,000 patients who received gender-affirming surgery, only 62 people regretted the surgery, which meant there was a 99.73% satisfaction rate. Out of the incredibly small number of people who sadly would go on to regret the surgery, there was 46 respondents. 22 of the patients regretted it due to a change in their identity, 8 of the patients regretted it due to a lack of social support, 7 of the patients regretted it due to it leading to a difficulty in relationships, and 9 of the patients regretted it due to surgical complications, meaning that from the 46 respondents of the 62 patients that regretted it, 24 of them regretted it due to external factors or complications and not due to the surgery actually being wrong for them. That's over half of the respondents. I am willing to take note of the fact, however, that if someone is going on to get surgery, they are probably already fairly far into their transition and are less likely to regret it. However, I think it's important to point out the incredibly low regret rate of surgery, since Shrier talks about it as a plague that's mutilating our daughters. Fun fact, in the study, there was more trans women who regretted transition than trans men. Maybe we should take a look at the overall regret rates, including HRT though, just to get a better idea of the regret rate. In the UK, a study was done with almost 3,400 patients that found only 16 regretted transition, a 99.53% satisfaction rate. Among these patients, out of the 16 people who expressed regret, 10 of these patients said they planned to only detransition temporarily, meaning they still decided transition was right for them, but for one reason or another they couldn't currently do it. So only 6 of the respondents actually regretted it, meaning the actual regret rate for personal reasons is about 0.18%. It is important to recognise, however, that it is incredibly difficult in the UK to receive trans-affirming healthcare, meaning it is harder for people who aren't as sure about being trans to go through with attempting to transition, which could be attributed to the low rates of regret. So let's look over to America, where trans-affirming healthcare is more readily available, assuming you have the money. In America, they studied nearly 28,000 trans patients and found 8% of them decided to detransition, which is a much higher number than the UK stat. But let's look at the reason for detransition among the 8% of respondents. 62% of the 8% reported their detransition was only temporary and they were currently living in the gender they transitioned to. This means of this 8%, only about 3% actually detransitioned. Despite this book claiming claiming that trans men are at a huge risk of detransition, this study also found that trans women were over twice as likely to detransition. However, considering the fact most patients only detransition temporarily, both trans men and women have a very low percentage of detransition. Looking at the amount of people who actually detransitioned because they decided transition wasn't right for them, only 5% said they detransitioned because they realized transition was not right for them, which represents 0.4% of the 22,000 people actually regretting transition for personal reasons. 36% detransitioned from pressure from a parent, 26% detransitioned due to pressure from family members, and 18% detransitioned because of pressure from their spouse. 36% also stated one of the reasons that they detransitioned being the amount of harassment they faced after transition, and 29% reported one of the reasons being that they had trouble getting employment. I'd like to point out that there's often this idea that more accessible trans healthcare leads to a high regret rate among patients. However, what we discover looking at these studies is that the UK, who has some of the strictest trans healthcare requirements in the West from my knowledge, has a very similarly low regret rate to that of the US, where trans healthcare is easy to get considering you have the financial means to get it. Of course, with easier access does come more cases of regret, but based off these studies, even with easy access to healthcare, the regret rate is incredibly low, especially low among trans men, which is important to take into account considering that's what this book focuses on. Shrier also goes on to say this: "This is a story Americans need to hear. Whether or not you have an adolescent daughter, whether or not your child has fallen for this transgender craze, America has become fertile ground for this mass enthusiasm for reasons that have everything to do with our cultural frailty. Parents are undermined, experts are over-relied upon, dissenters in science and medicine are intimidated, free speech truckles under renewed attack, government healthcare laws harbour hidden consequences, and an intersectional era has arisen in which the desire to escape a dominant identity encourages individuals to take cover in victim groups." Why is it always about America? It's not all about America, right? Shit happens outside of America. Shut the fuck up about America. Fuck America. I'm joking. I like America. Some Americans are pretty cool. What she's talking about a lot in this so far are people who are considered transgenders, people who identify as trans because it's trendy. I don't know the prevalence of transgenders, however, one thing I can say for sure is that these are not trans people if they're doing it to be trendy. They're cis people. Despite this, it's painted like trans people are the problem here for spreading their transness. Most trans people don't even talk about being trans that much, but no one acknowledges those people because they aren't very noticeable, so people judge their view of trans people on the vocal minority, as opposed to approaching each trans individual as just that, an individual, not a member of an ideological group. Trans is not an ideology, it's a label to describe an aspect of someone that has nothing to do with an ideology. I wouldn't say you're ideological for thinking humans deserve rights, and that's all trans people are, humans who deserve rights, and it's not coincidental and or ideological that of course they would all share the common belief that they deserve to have rights. Of course, each individual is different and has different views, so there is discourse around what rights exactly are and what steps and systems need to be put in place for them to have rights, but there's a general consensus that they clearly don't have them yet, and I trust the perspective of the people having the lived experience more than the people not having the lived experience. Andrew Tate is ignorant as fuck, but if he can realise this, I don't get how you can't.
That's what I say.
What do you think of transgender people?
That's nothing to do with me. I'm not transgender and I don't understand the issue like they do. They
Are
can
you
do whatever
transphobic? Do you consider yourself that?
Transphobic? What, afraid?
Well, it kind of, yeah. You have
I don't live in fear, my friend. I have no problem.
Do you have a dislike of transgender people?
I don't know any transgender people.
Do you have a dislike of what they stand for, what they are?
No. Why would I?
I don't know.
That's not my issue. That's not my issue. And that's actually quite interesting because when I was attacked, a lot of these stupid articles like BuzzFeed, because it's ridiculous, that first point proves anyone with a brain knows that that's garbage. When they attacked me, they lump a whole bunch of things in together. They say misogynistic, racist, transphobic. They just put them all together at random.
No,
I'm mixed race.
By the way,
I don't know where they get these. They just get these buzzwords and put them in a sentence.
By the way, I completely agree.
It's crazy.
And I've had the same thing done to me.
Okay, well,
and I'm not
then.
calling you anything. I'm asking you what you personally believe you are.
It's not an issue I discuss. What I do discuss is that...
So you support transgender people?
I support individual liberty. I'm a libertarian.
Yeah, so you support transgender people?
Sure. Sure, why not?
She also says that she primarily relies on the parents' understanding of their child's situation, which is retarded because someone is clearly going to understand their own lived experience better than their parents considering they lived it. It's not an uncommon thing for parents to think they know what's best for their kid and force things upon them that they hate. Not to say that parents don't have an incredibly difficult job, but it's not uncommon for parents and their kids to have a large gap in their understanding of each other. If it was truly so obvious to the parent, a child would never have to come out to them, and if if the behaviours of gender dysphoria were so obviously peculiar, they would be remembered much better by the parent as opposed to the child. However, it makes much more sense that a trans person would remember their experiences of feeling gender dysphoria or euphoria in certain circumstances than a parent would, especially if a parent isn't actively looking for symptoms of gender dysphoria, and why would they be? She then goes on to say this, which is in heavy contrast to her reliance on the parent accounts. Parents cannot entirely be trusted to know how their adolescents feel about their transgender identities or the new lies forged in its name, but parents can report the facts of their kids' academic or professional standing, their financial stability and family formation or lack thereof, and even sometimes their social successes and failures. Are these transgender identified adolescents still in school, or did they drop out? Do they maintain contact with old friends? Do they speak to any family members at all? Are they building forward to a future with a romantic partner? Are they engaged in subsistence living wages from the local coffee shop? This is also incredibly irrelevant. If a cis person has a bad academic career, we don't assume it's because they're cis. Not to mention, discrimination from peers could damage mental health and cause their performance to become worse. Same could be said for their professional status and or financial ability. It's no secret financial status can be heavily negatively impacted by workplace or systemic discrimination. Socializing can also be hard due to discrimination. Staying connected with old friends can be hard, as it can probably feel like they'd never see you for you. Getting a romantic partner can also be hard for trans people. Even in spite of all these things, why does it matter? Does someone have to fit your ideals of success and fulfillment to be considered valid? Not everyone wants a professional career or to reach academic heights. If they can, some people feel just fine working in that coffee shop, and if they're fulfilled doing that, then what's the problem? Someone has to serve you your coffee. Not everyone values the same things, not everyone has the same goals, not everyone is fulfilled the same way. I think it's incredibly narrow-minded and unscientific to track the status of someone's success in transition by these factors. To give her some degree of credit, she did say this: "I do not pretend to capture these adolescents' whole stories, much less the fullness of the trans experience. Transgender success stories are everywhere, told and celebrated. They march under the banner of civil rights. They promise to breach the next cultural frontier, to shatter one more basis of human division. But the phenomenon sweeping teenage girls is different. It originates not in traditional gender dysphoria, but in videos found on the internet. It represents mimicry inspired by internet gurus, a pledge taken with girlfriends, hands and breath held, eyes squeezed shut. For these girls, trans identification offers freedom from anxiety, relentless pursuit. It satisfies the deepest need for acceptance, the thrill of transgression, the seductive lilt of belonging." She is amazing at writing dramatically. Honestly, fucking, she needs to write a novel. Like, I'm being serious. She could write a really good novel. I'm not even capping. She could write a really good novel. I'd fucking read that shit. What is it with transphobes and, like, being amazing fucking writers? Like, we got fucking J.K. Rowling, now Abigail Shrier, bro. I don't know what it is, bro, but the transphobes just, they can write. No, I don't think Abigail Shrier is a transphobe, honestly. I don't. It's really fun to talk shit about her, though, but I don't know whether her intentions are in the right place, but I don't think she's transphobic. Still, though, get on that fucking novel. Okay, in the script, next says she's transphobic, so act like I didn't just say it, and that this is a new thing you're hearing from me. Here she claims what she's talking about is not trans people as a whole, and honestly, I believe her. From what I've heard in her interviews, I don't think she hates trans people, but I do think she's ignorant to trans issues. I don't think she's transphobic, but I think a lot of her views are, because, I mean, what is transphobia? Well, homophobia was granted in the fear that gay people would in some way harm or destroy some aspect of society, and transphobia is just the same thing with trans people. Also, do I think Abigail Shrier is open to new ideas on the topic? Fuck no. She's made way too much money and gained way too much popularity from having these views. To change them would destroy her brand, income, and alienate her from the only mass audience that will accept her. As again, the largest reason for detransition is a lack of parental support, something she encourages in this book, as we read in the blurb. Another one of the biggest reasons people detransition is a lack of social acceptance. It's not trendy or socially acceptable to be trans, otherwise that wouldn't be the biggest reason for detransition. And that's another thing about the whole transgender idea. I think honestly that only occurs in people that are like chronically online and don't go out in the real world, because if you take a second to analyze the real world, you'll realize those people they do not have a place in most places of society. There might be a lot of places online for them, but in society, in the real world, there's not really any. This is the story of the American family. Decent, loving, hardworking, and kind. Fuck off. It wants to do the right thing, but it finds itself set in a society that increasingly regards parents as obstacles, bigots, and dupes. We cheer as teenage girls with with no history of dysphoria steep themselves in a radical gender ideology taught in school or found on the internet. Peers and therapists and teachers and internet heroes egg these girls on. But here, the cost of so much youthful indiscretion is not a piercing or tattoo, it's closer to a pound of flesh. This type of language clearly heavily caters to conservative values and the ideal of the American family. If you truly wanted to do the right thing, you take the 20 minutes I just spent out of your day to look at the studies and find that there is an incredibly large satisfaction rate among trans people who receive healthcare and incredibly low satisfaction rates. And also realize the biggest factors for the already low detransition rates being that family, partners, and friends were being unaccepting. It literally took me 20 minutes to figure that out. You probably spent 20 minutes on like a few pages of this book. I know you're capable of reading and writing for 20 minutes. You have zero excuses for the ignorance. Here she also states a point I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about, which I hate because I like Jordan Peterson, but his takes on trans people are retarded, and they all seem to be lifted from Abigail Shrier. The point she's making here is that being trans is a counterculture fashion statement akin to that of tattoos and piercings, and I feel like I shouldn't even have to discount this because I don't even have words to describe how wrong that take is. Like, it blows my mind, but I will in case anyone watching this believes this shit, because I used to believe it too, so I get it, but also I don't get how I believed it. I wasn't really thinking about it. I was just wrapped up in an ideological view of trans people, and it made sense in my little bubble of cherry-picked information. So for one, as a young person, I feel qualified to tell you most people are at best tolerant of trans people, and a disproportionate amount of people have a negative view of trans people. There is no trustworthy data on the number of trans people, but it's estimated to make up about 1% of the UK population. However, this is an estimate, and I can't find any sources that give an actual trustworthy data set. And from my experience living in the UK since I was born, I have interacted with a lot of people here and have yet to run into a single trans person from my knowledge. According to worldpopulationreview.com, trans adults make up less than 1% of the population in each state and about 2% of the overall adult population. However, I'm not sure about how trustworthy their data is. Ignore the bad audio. After I had finished recording and editing this whole thing, the UK census dropped for last year, and it found that 0.10 or 0.1% of the population identified as trans. So that's some actual good data. All this stuff will be linked, so take it with a grain of salt, but this is the only data that I could find. On top of this, counterculture requires an ideology. Every counterculture movement has an ideology, and usually counterculture movements in the West have been very liberal ideologies. Being trans is not an ideology. Many trans people probably subscribe to a lot of similar liberal and libertarian ideologies, but that's no surprise considering they're the only side of politics that seems to actually hold any compassion for them. There are trans people who subscribe to conservative ideals, a popular one being Blair White. Blair White is not just one of the good ones, it's just that if you're ideologically inclined to the right, you probably feel like you can relate to her more and therefore have a bigger degree of respect for her because she feels like a breath of fresh air. If trans was an ideological fashion statement, transgender conservatives wouldn't exist because that fashion statement would be in direct contrast to their actual beliefs. I also recognise Shrier comments that real trans people do exist, but is just claiming that many trans people that exist today are not trans and simply doing it as an ideological fashion statement, which I would disagree with. You may see more trans people in left-leaning spaces and following left-leaning ideologies, but if you're a person who doesn't know they're trans in a conservative space and not exposed to many contrasting values and ways of life, then you may never discover you're trans and just deal with that dysphoria your whole life. Even if you do recognise you're trans, you probably recognise that the space you're in isn't going to be supportive of you if you come out, and if you do try to come out, you're likely to be pushed back into the closet by unsupportive family members, which, as I pointed out earlier, is one of the largest reasons that may cause someone to detransition. In more left-leaning spaces, however, where someone is more free to be themselves, explore themselves, and be exposed to non-standard lifestyles, someone is much more likely to be able to find themselves and express themselves honestly without fear of discrimination in that space, which is why it's normal to see a larger degree of trans people in left-leaning spaces. As mentioned earlier, the shared lifestyle experience is also going to lead to similar perspectives and unique insights, which are going to cause them to be more inclined to left-leaning ideas. This, however, is not reflective of leftist ideologies, but instead reflective of the trans experience. Those who experience oppression and are sick of it when open to the doors of liberation, are more likely to join the side fighting for their liberty. There's a reason not many gay people were conservative when gay people first started entering the mainstream. The libs weren't turning people gay, but conservatives just weren't the ones fighting for the liberation of gay people. I don't have an issue with conservatives, and I think both liberals and conservatives are incredibly important to ensure we live in a fair and stable society. However, it's nothing new that conservatives generally fight for traditional values, and LGBT people aren't traditionally the most accepted group. The idea of a gender ideology pushed by right-leaning activists like Shrier and Matt Walsh is a straw man. It's something they made up as a conspiracy that they can attach any situations or ideas onto and claim, look, the gender ideology is taking over. But there's not a gender ideology. No one identifies their beliefs with a gender ideology. People identify with conservative ideology, liberal ideology, Marxist ideology, fascist ideology, etc. But no one is identifying their beliefs with gender ideology because it's not real. All that is being said is sex does not define your gender, which is just a fact. And if you want to learn more on that, watch my video where I go into it, it'll be in the description. I made that video when I doubted the legitimacy of trans people. When I started that video, I literally didn't agree with it, and by the end of it, after looking at the research, I had decided trans people were valid, and I take you on that journey with me. She goes on to say that the ideology is luring girls to transition and be dependent on medical surgeries and hormones, etc., which is just bullshit because trans men can stop testosterone after long enough and they keep their deep voice and most of the changes associated with testosterone. There are medical surgeries, but from my knowledge, after those surgeries are over, they're over, and they are completely optional, and it's very often stated among trans people that you do not need to have the surgeries to be valid or the hormones or anything. One of the traps that trans people find themselves in is that if they don't transition to look more like the gender they identify with, they get ridiculed for not trying hard enough to fit into society and for expecting the world to revolve around them when they aren't trying. And if they do make the changes to themselves, they have another side shouting at them that they're mutilating their bodies and denying their biology. So no matter what they do and which path they take, they literally can't win. She also says no adolescent should pay this big of a price for being briefly a follower, and I just find it really funny because she acts like it's a cult, and a lot of people that hold these views do genuinely think it's a fucking hell. There's Shrier's coming to fucking bomb me, bro. She is not happy about this. Fuck. Right, she's gone. I think I'm safe for now. I just find it funny because she acts like it's a cult, and a lot of people that hold these views genuinely do think it's like a fucking gender cult. It's so fucking dumb. Right, that has been the author's note, the blurb, and the book introduction that we've covered in this video, and it is 40 minutes long. This is going to be a very long series. I'm going to cover every chapter in this book. Each episode I'm going to cover a chapter of this book, and so I'm not really going to make a full schedule for this, but I am going to try get it out somewhat consistently, but I can't promise anything. So if you're excited to see the rest of this, then, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications to get notifications when I do upload the next episode. Like the video, comment what you think, because I try to respond to comments, and usually I do, and if I don't, it sounds like a skill issue, bro. I can't lie. But yeah, that's it. Enjoy your fucking day.